Okay, so time for a controversial opinion. I think that the former attraction in Epcot's Norway pavilion, Maelstrom, isn't as good as everyone remembers it being. In fact, I'd say that Frozen Ever After is the better attraction. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. What? Poseidon Entertainment? I thought that you hated Disney IP. And yeah, fair. If you've watched my videos, you know I'm not shy about expressing how much I dislike the attractions debuting at the Disney parks. They are, for the most part, just cheap filler with an IP slapped onto them. But here's the thing. Frozen Ever After is actually pretty good. If we treat it as a Fantasyland dark ride, it's designed really well. The problem, obviously, is that it's not located in Fantasyland. Maelstrom was clearly a much better fit, not just for the Norway pavilion, but for the Epcot theme of international edutainment. I think because Frozen's placement is such a cynical middle finger to the intellectual capacity of the Disney guests, though, people tend to view Maelstrom in a more positive way in retrospect. Today, I'm interested in breaking down these two attractions. I want to highlight why Maelstrom was so appropriate for this pavilion, but really had some fundamental issues that are often overlooked. On the flip side, I want to talk about why Frozen Ever After is actually pretty great for a fantasy IP attraction, and yet I hate it because it's just in the worst place possible. From the start, Maelstrom teased itself to guests from the outside. As the boat moved backwards on the ride, guests could see it poke out from the rocks as it switched to resume forward motion. It's an interesting element that helped lure guests into the building. As you enter the queue though, this is where my criticism first starts. As you can see, this queue has absolutely no theming. The overall theme of the attraction itself is to take you on a journey through the history and culture of Norway. Because of this, I understand why the queue is presented almost as a blank slate, so as not to tie it to any particular time period, featuring only the mural right before you board. That being said, I really like the Frozen queue in contrast. While the city of Arendelle is being portrayed here, you could just assume it was an Old Norse village if you didn't know there was an IP attached. I know that the queue has been rerouted and expanded for Frozen, but something like this for Maelstrom from the start would have done a really great job of setting up the attraction and its atmosphere. For what it is though, I won't blame it because it was a product of its time and a purposeful design choice. As you board the boat and embark on your journey, you first encounter some ruins and climb a hill where you encounter the Norse god Odin.
You are not the first to pass this way. The last. Those who seek the spirit of Norway face peril and adventure, but more often find beauty and charm.
It appears that you've traveled back in time, encountering a Norse village and witnessing the adventures of seafarers. From here, the boat travels into a swamp, where the guests encounter a scene drawn from Norse mythology. They encounter a Nook, a malevolent water spirit, and a troll who casts a spell to banish the riders from the swamp. From this point, the boat changes course and travels backwards, where polar bears are revealed. Guests continue and enter a forest, where another Nook peeks out as the boat changes direction and tumbles down a waterfall. In this last scene, guests emerge out into the sea, viewing a Norwegian oil platform. Now, this might seem strange, because it is. Disney didn't just fund the pavilion and attraction themselves. Funding also came from the Norwegian government, as well as 11 corporate sponsors who influenced the attraction to take on elements of advertising Norway as a travel destination. While the oil rig is a strange choice, I think it's meant to illustrate how Norway is a modern and industrious country. When Maelstrom first opened, it was also marketed as Epcot's first thrill ride, mostly because of the drop and the original version of the oil rig had waves soaking the guests. I suppose that getting caught in the storm was seen as a thrilling element. As the attraction concludes, guests enter a fishing village and sit down to view a film, displaying the modern Norway as a travel destination. I'm certainly not the first to point this out, but what makes Maelstrom so strange is how it lacks cohesion. Exploring the history of the Norse people and immersing the guests into their mythology is an interesting attraction in and of itself. However, to mix in a scene showing that Norway has polar bears, and then to broadcast that Norway is worth a visit because it has oil rigs, is one of the strangest messages I've ever seen. Perhaps you would think that the end video would clarify the message, but instead it makes the case that the people embody the spirit of Norway, as it were, where the hardships of their Viking ancestors translate into some strange work ethic in oil extraction. I wouldn't say that Maelstrom was a bad ride, in fact I would consider it a cult classic. But the strange tonal shifts and lack of clarity in the message is a large detractor. Had the attraction been either a focus on history and mythology, or a full display of Norway's beauty and merits, it would have worked a lot better. I think that given the right direction, both could have actually worked well together if given a cohesive narrative. Take the queue, for example. The story could have started there, having you traveling through a forest and moving through a Viking camp, as mysterious mythical creatures are spying on you from a distance. From there, you would embark on a riverboat, moving through a fjord, and a more cohesive story would play out. It's not that Maelstrom was particularly weak as an attraction, because its quirky nature and atmosphere was definitely a strength. However, it very clearly had different actors fighting for influence over the narrative, and so that's ultimately why the attraction isn't as strong as people seem to remember. In contrast, we now have Frozen Ever After, which premiered in 2016. I'm not going to go over the story of this attraction, because if you've seen the film, you know exactly what it is, and this is just the highlight of the story beats. That doesn't sound very exciting, right? If I'm going to criticize Maelstrom for its lack of cohesive story, why would I praise Frozen for its shortened retelling of the film? Well, Frozen very much follows in the footsteps of many classic Fantasyland dark rides, and that it tells a more condensed version of the animated film. Now, I know that not all of these attractions stick to the story beats, as something like Mr. Toad's Wild Ride is interested in expanding on the original material. However, these attractions all generally tend to follow the story beats pretty well, and Frozen follows in this design philosophy. That's why I never understood the criticism of this ride only being highlights of the film. I mean, it's doing exactly what I expect it to do. Another aspect of the attraction that I'm willing to praise is the overall atmosphere. The set design, lighting, and animatronics really create a dense environment that's easy to get lost in. Yes, I know that if you look across the track away from some of the scenes, you might just find a wall painted black, but this is common in a number of dark ride attractions. No one is looking to the left of the boat in the rainstorm scene of Living with the Land and wondering why the wall is painted black, so why apply that standard here? Another criticism that I've often heard is the projection faces and how they look not great. I agree, but the actual quality of the animatronics themselves are undeniably top-notch. If Frozen Ever After were located in Fantasyland, this would absolutely be hailed as the next greatest dark ride. However, we can all clearly see the problem. If Epcot is a place to celebrate real-world nations and culture, how appropriate is it to represent a country with an animated film for children? Some people might say, well, Frozen is based on The Snow Queen, penned by Hans Christian Andersen. But clearly, those people haven't even bothered to read even a synopsis of that story, as Frozen has almost nothing to do with it. What angers me is that while Frozen may be a great attraction, it still signals laziness from Disney leadership. It shows that Bob Iger couldn't be bothered to maintain the theme of Epcot, opting instead for an attraction that would encourage short-term merch sales. Adding IP to Epcot is, in general, a lazy and short-term solution in addressing the issues of the park. Instead of updating the park and keeping it fresh, the attitude is, oh hey, people love franchises and franchises are timeless. We don't have to worry about updating this park anymore because now the Guardians of the Galaxy will pay lip service to the Big Bang. That's the exact attitude with Frozen. Maelstrom may have been flawed, but at the very least it was an honest attempt at trying to inspire guests to learn more about Norway. To think that you can summarize the culture of a country with an animated film for children is, I think, a cynical slap in the face to the guests. It reveals how little Disney leadership thinks of them, and shows a blatant disrespect for their intellectual capacity. Yes, Frozen may be a good attraction, but it was also the first step in the destruction of Epcot. The damage being done to this park is reaching a point where it will be difficult to reverse, and I suspect won't age as well as Disney thinks it will. It's quite a shame that Disney never found a place for Frozen in the Magic Kingdom. I understand that space is limited, but the desperation to bring the Frozen IP into the parks resulted in the worst decision possible. Yes, I still do think that Frozen Ever After is a superior attraction to Maelstrom, but considering it's a poor excuse for cultural representation, I will take back Maelstrom immediately if it was an option. Despite its flaws, it reveals that Disney was once interested in creative experiences that went outside the box, challenging its guests to learn more after they left the attraction. Maelstrom was certainly outdated, but there were so many creative avenues that Disney could have explored. Even an attraction focusing just on Norse mythology itself could have been something truly grand and inspiring. I think then that I want to conclude with this. Maelstrom wasn't great, but the introduction of Frozen has led many people to view it more favorably in retrospect. Maelstrom didn't exist to insult the guests, instead respecting their ability to understand an attraction without a cartoon attached. It may have been flawed at a fundamental level, but its strange scenes and story were a part of its charm. That being said, I'd be interested in seeing whether you agree with me or not, if you want to drop your opinion down in the comments below. As always, you can help the video reach a wider audience by just hitting the like button, and if you like these types of videos, I strongly encourage you to hit the subscribe button with bell notification to be alerted when they're published.